Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Simply Trade Roundup. My name's Annik. I'll be your host today, as I am every time. I know you missed me. I'm back in the studio. This is the first time in probably weeks, which is kind of weird, but I'm excited to be here. And I have a new guest who has never been on the show before, but we have lots of things coming up with him, which is just fantastic. And I want to introduce him. And honestly, I don't know if I'm going to make him justice because he has an extensive background in the industry. So his name is Valentin Povarchuk. He is a senior counsel at Akrivis Law Group. And he's been in the industry for, I don't want to butcher this, over 2 decades?
About 20 years.
Okay, great. And he has written, some awesome blogs to discuss, and he's done some great things in the industry that we will kind of talk on more. So I also want to give him the opportunity to speak on himself because I think he can give you in detail exactly what he's doing in this industry and what his significance is, because I feel like I can't do this justice. So I'm going to give it up to you, Valentin. By the way, it is so great having you on, and excited to talk more on what we'll talk about today, which we'll get into in a bit.
Thank you for welcoming me, Annik. It's such a great pleasure to be on your illustrious show, and I'm looking forward to our collaboration with Global Training Center. As you mentioned, I've been in this business of advising clients on issues of trade compliance for over 20 years now, and through my career working as a lawyer, starting in some big law firms and then working in-house in some big companies. And now recently, about a year ago, I left one of these big companies and started working in a smaller boutique law firm, still advising clients on matters of international trade. And while throughout my career, I've done pretty much everything in the area of international trade, including customs law and anti-dumping cases and export controls and sanctions. So, I'm still working in all these areas. There are some areas where I don't consider myself to be a thought leader and some areas where I do. So in particular, you have many great guests and wonderful colleagues who are thought leaders and top experts in customs, and they've been speaking about tariffs and other challenges that our nation faces. And I'm not that. So I'm more of an expert and thought leader in the area of export controls and sanctions. And that's what I've been focusing the most in my in-house roles, working with big companies, helping them establish corporate compliance programs to manage the risks of these very, very complex regulatory frameworks that they're facing from the United States and in other countries as well. And I'm happy to be in a position to work with all kinds of companies and help them with these matters and to do some of this education through Global Training Center.
Thank you so much. And, one of the biggest topics, which we've been talking about last year, a little bit more than, the year before last year even. I mean, because last year was all tariffs, right? But semiconductor equipment has become a big controversial issue. We've heard a lot about it. We've heard a lot of back and forth on what is permitted, what is not permitted. And I think export controls have been a little bit let down since we've gone into this era of facing other issues, hence tariffs. And so I'm glad to talk to you about this because you recently, March 11th, actually, you posted a blog in which is the lessons from the applied materials case, which essentially was a case on the major American manufacturer of semiconductor equipment, correct?
Right. Iron and implanting machines.
It was a settlement case. I think it's great to touch on this today, to just make other companies aware of that there are certain, problems out there that we need to look at. And especially if we're companies that were getting into the semiconductor space, or if you're in the semiconductor space, to look at your company and say, oh, we might be doing something wrong, especially if you're, and this is one of your strengths, which is export control and the entity list, right? Which has been growing and needs to be assessed probably more often than ever now by companies. So can we go over the case a little bit? Can you explain what happened?
Sure. I'll be happy to do that. Before we get to discussing this specific case, I want to also respond to the way you started your comment. You're right to note that regulation of semiconductor exports, but not just the microchips, because there are a few companies that microchips. But what our government has been concerned about is the export of the strategically important software and technologies and equipment that can help create the top of the line microchips, the ones that are used to train artificial intelligence. So that is really seen as a strategic asset. And both the Biden administration and the Trump administration are really paying a lot of attention to this area.
I want to know, rightfully so, because obviously there's a huge concern with China. That is probably the biggest concern they have, right? The country being China, or are there other countries that are similar affected?
Yes, definitely. China is seen as our really strategic adversary technologically, and that is the greatest area of concern. There are other countries kind of in that group with China. That includes Russia and Belarus and a number of other countries, but the capabilities of Chinese manufacturing is what is really seen as a potential strategic threat to us. There are differences in which the Biden administration and the Trump administration are facing these challenges. The Biden administration in January 2025 introduced what was called the AI diffusion rule. And so it would have imposed licensing requirements on exports of certain kinds of technologies and chips everywhere worldwide. And then, they would grant some of these licenses, presumably to allied countries, but really established limits on how much computing capacity this regulatory scheme would allow other countries to establish. The Trump administration very quickly noted that it doesn't like this rule. It intends to revoke it and replace it. So far, they have not replaced it. And so there is a lot of churn and hand-wringing in the industry as to how is this going to look. And we don't yet really have a lot of guidance to go by, but the sense is that the Trump administration's approach to it is more transactional, and they see access to our technologies as something that potentially can be traded away in trade negotiations. So it's a different approach. There's a lot of uncertainty right now about how it's going to look. But it's also clear that the Trump administration, just like the previous administrations, and it's not just, the administration priorities, there's a very much of a bipartisan consensus in our country among legislators also that China represents a threat to us and that we need to control access to these kinds of strategic technologies. And that's where this case comes in. It shows the priority of enforcement.
I want to make a quick note on this because I think, and this is very recent, is that, obviously currently we're in a war with Iran, and which is just so weird to say. But China has been in talks with Iran, which I would think could make this even worse with what is going to happen within the export controls portion of this, because we might just cut off everything with China. I mean, I could see it going there just because of the recent history, what we've been going through already. So this is definitely something that is very current. Now, you mentioned the case. Yes.
What happened in that case is that the government designated the biggest Chinese semiconductor manufacturing company. It goes by the abbreviation SMIC, SMIC, as a restricted entity on the entity list. And even before designating it, it sent a so-called is-informed letter to Applied Materials that said, we don't like this entity, you shouldn't be doing business with them. And then they put SMIC on the entity list. And what they found later is that Applied Materials continued to sell its ion implanting equipment to SMIC. And so, of course, that led our government to be quite disappointed with Applied Materials. But, I've also been on the inside of these companies. And actually, I just went to a conference in San Francisco where I worked with other experts in this industry, other export control lawyers and trade compliance management people. And we did this really great exercise in the conference where instead of just people talking to us from the podium, we split into groups and were presented with a scenario that was similar to the Applied Materials case, and we're each given a role. One person was outside counsel, another person was the general counsel of the company, another person was, the head of trade compliance, and another person was the CEO. And I got to be the CEO. And that really, really taught us a lot about how decisions like this are made. And some of it didn't surprise me because I know that companies, when they're facing this kind of decisions about whether to continue to do a business with a business partner that is subject to some restrictions, it's not necessarily an easy decision because you may be able to do it legally, but is it still a good idea to do it? And
do you think that, and this, again, this might be controversial now. Obviously, the Trump administration has a little bit of a history of making prompt decisions, making decisions that might not fully be justified. I don't know, justified in some people's eyes, right? We all have our differences. But do you think they made the choice to keep business with them because they just didn't see a danger, because they had their own reasons and said, you know what, we feel like this is still a good choice for us. We don't think we're doing anything wrong. We don't think there's any malicious activity happening here. And so we just don't agree. Or do you think they just don't care and it's like profit based?
I think, I do want to be as charitable to private companies as possible because, so many of us in our economy depend on our ability to continue to do business. And these big technology companies and the leaders who lead them, they really have to think about not only about compliance with laws, but also about continuing the existence of their company. So in the scenario that we were dealing with, there was also a restricted company and they accounted for something like 25% of the company's revenue. And so the CEO, if the CEO had decided to stop doing business with that, that is also a decision that he would have to have explained to the board of directors and justify why they're doing this, why the company is turning down a huge portion of their business and their revenue, and maybe terminating many workers who make products for this customer. So that's why I think it's important to realize that there's so many aspects to this decision making. Legal compliance is one of these aspects, and legal compliance is not always black and white. So what we saw in the case of Applied Materials is that the company sought for ways to continue selling their products to SMIC, and they thought they found by saying, we're not going to, we're making this ion implanting machines in Massachusetts, but what we think we can do is establish another plant in South Korea, and we're going to export partially made ion implanting machines and finish making them in South Korea. And in South Korea, they did, substantial amount of investment in that plant. They brought in a lot of sophisticated equipment, and they established operations sufficient in South Korea. There was some assembly and some testing. So really substantial amount of manufacturing as far as I can see from this case, so that they were able to conclude now this product, the ion implanting machine, is not going to be U.S. origin, but because we're doing a substantial transformation here in South Korea, it's going to be a South Korean product.
Yeah.
And I think it was on the basis of this that they thought they could get away with this. So I am quite confident, being on the inside of this kind of decision making, this was not a mistake. This was a very deliberately planned strategy.
Sounds intentional, for sure.
And I'm sure that expert lawyers and other compliance professionals advised the company, and they probably knew there was some risk in it, but they did it anyway. And that's because the decision making that goes into, how to do business in the circumstances, it certainly accounts for that risk and compliance concerns, but there are other factors that go into it. And that is, how do we continue to do business that is so important to our company? And so, what the US government, the position that they took when they discovered this is that, no, you cannot do this. Substantial transformation does not matter for the purposes of compliance with the export administration regulations.
But was that stated exactly in the regulations?
That is not stated in the regulations, and it is still a mystery. There's no definition of what constitutes a foreign-made product for the purposes of determining whether a foreign-made product is subject to the EAR, subject to U.S. export control jurisdiction.
Mm.
So if you have, the regulations as such, for the purposes of selling to a company on the entity list, if you have a foreign-made product that contains 25% or less of export-controlled U.S. content, then, less than 25% would be a more accurate way to put it, then your product is not subject to the EAR, which means it's not subject to U.S. export control regulatory jurisdiction. And then, legally speaking, you should be able to continue to sell that product to a customer that's on the entity list. Now, there's another layer of complexity. There are some entities on the entity list that are now subject to foreign direct product restrictions, and they're designated with special footnotes 1, 3, 4, 5. And there it's a different analysis because there are even foreign-made products that are made with certain export-controlled U.S. technologies or software, or even made on equipment that is the product of export-controlled U.S. technology or software. Then those foreign direct products are also going to be subject to the EAR. But in this case, SMIC was not subject to those foreign direct product restrictions, which is what I think in the minds of people who were making these decisions at Applied Materials and those who were advising them, they thought they could do it. So it was a risk management decision for them. They thought they could do it, but our government said, no, you definitely cannot do it. And I think a big part of it, it's not just, the inventiveness of the company in creating this solution that they thought would enable them to continue to do business. What I see increasingly is that, let's say, regulators, increasingly, they're less concerned about the nuances and legal complexities. They just want you to do what they told you to do. They want you these days to comply not only with the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the restrictions.
So would you say that an is-informed letter would be a stop sign rather than a yellow light?
From the point of view of the regulators, this should be an absolute stop sign.
So in your perspective, you think when they made this decision, they should have seen this as, no, we should not continue selling to this company? Or would you have sided with the risk management that said, look, we might be able to get away with this. Like, this is fine. Also, how is there not a way, and this might be interesting for companies, but if you make such a big decision, and maybe this is far-fetched right now, like maybe this is in my dreams, but can't you just go and be like writing to the government, hey, like, can we do this before you do it? And then you save $252 million. Can you do that?
Yes, these are very good questions. And I as a lawyer, I think I'd have to answer your questions overall with it depends.
Okay.
But your suggestion is good. In general, if you're going to do something risky, then why not be transparent with the government and go and actually apply for that export license? Because our export control restrictions are imposed in the form of export licensing requirements. And it does not mean that you absolutely cannot do it. It means you have to ask the government for permission. But that can also be very difficult because these licensing decisions, especially in the context of politically and strategically sensitive questions can take a very long time to obtain from the government.
I see that. Yeah. And that's
Unfortunately,
probably the issue.
yeah. And the business does not wait. Again, the scenario that I practiced a couple of days ago in this conference, you had, other competitors were ready and willing to sell these products from other countries to the customer, and the licensing would take many months, and it will be very uncertain how it would go. So all of these factors are very realistic. In addition, in this past year, we have lost a lot of the capacity in the regulatory agencies, the people who are making these licensing decisions. A lot of them have left the government, and there are efforts to replace them now, but a lot of that capacity has been lost. There's been a lot of brain drain. So right now in the industry, there's a lot of uncertainty about how licensing is, there's been very significant delays and issues in of licensing. Expertise is lacking. You have to do a lot more explaining. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about how export licensing is going to work. So in advising companies on how to deal with this, it's really hard to say, you should never do anything risky.
Yeah.
On one hand. On the other hand, the risks are very high in certain sectors of the economy. So it's a very complicated situation. And it's definitely very interesting and challenging to be in that position of helping companies navigate these risks. I've done it as an in-house lawyer, where you really felt like you were at that tip of the spear of U.S. policy enforcement in China. And now I'm in a position to help other companies as external counsel in helping them manage these risks. I think the good news for the kinds of companies that I see as my clients now, they're more likely to be smaller technology companies, some startups. A lot of them develop interesting software and interesting technologies, and they need to know about the risks out there. They're engaged in international business. They need to understand the risk environment and how to address this risk environment by performing due diligence on who they're doing business with, and sometimes implementing certain contractual language and use certifications, or responding to requests related to export compliance. So I think the risks for smaller companies tend to be still very important, but maybe less kind of enterprise risks.
Yeah.
Because it's really the largest, most powerful companies that are at the target of enforcement right now.
Yeah. And I think that risk it's a little bit like when you're in Vegas, you make a lot of risky choices. It is not 50-50, but I think there's obviously always a chance that this risk is going to go the wrong way. You can make a choice and it can be the best calculated choice in risk you made. It can still go wrong. So you really cannot be mad. That sucks to say because they lost 252 million, but you really cannot be mad. You made the choice knowing this could possibly happen, right?
Yeah.
So you did your best bet here. And I think a lot of companies are figuring that out. I also do think that right now we're at a critical standpoint where this risk is just going to grow even higher. And you might have to deviate to not making any risky risks right now. And maybe before it was a little easier to make a risk. But at this moment in time, I think it's a scary, weird place we're in where I don't know if you want to really risk it at this point, or you want to throw it out there and be like, I want to risk everything, right? I mean, it's like, what's your best bet?
It really is going to depend a lot on your risk profile and how can you manage these risks and what you're facing in the marketplace and how important it is for you to continue to do that international business. I want to briefly mention another recent case because it involves several very interesting issues, and we don't really have enough time to go into detail of all of them.
But I have to mention that you will be back for a free webinar, on due diligence on border trade, April 7th. So if you guys had not had enough of this conversation, which I haven't, and I would love to go more in detail, but you guys lose interest after a certain amount of time, you will have to jump into that free webinar and you can sign up for that. But go ahead and finish it off. That way we can round it up and close this out. So if you want to touch on it.
I want to mention this case because it gives me some hope. It's not all doom and gloom. So this is the case of Pterodyne Flare, which recently settled its violations with the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security for just $1 million. And that's a relatively small settlement for a corporate violator these days. And they did several things that upset the government. Some of them are pretty technical. They have to deal with the way that they valued their exports of components that went into thermal imaging camera. And there are several different aspects. The thing that upset the government the most probably was that they were in this joint venture with a Chinese drone manufacturer, and they had one pricing scheme for these thermal imaging cameras that they were providing to the drone manufacturer. And then they charged for the next generation of that product. They changed the pricing scheme, so the drone manufacturer was paying them more for that part. And BIS got very upset about this, and they said that this change in the pricing was designed in part to affect the de minimis analysis so that their product would not be subject to the R. That's a really very interesting thing that they said in part, because arguably in part it was also driven by whatever commercial legitimate reasons. So anyway, the government was very disappointed that they did it this way. There was another violation where the company failed to screen the address to which they were shipping, an address that did not have the entity name associated with that. So that reminds us that it's important to screen not only the entity names, but also the addresses to which you ship. But the way in which this case was encouraging is that it looks like Pterodyne Flare did their own. They discovered these violations. They did a very thorough investigation. And it looks like probably they had good external lawyers helping them to do this very thorough and transparent investigation. And they disclosed all of this to the government voluntarily. And I think that's the good news, that they got very, very significant mitigation. Their penalties could have been much, much higher. They also could have involved mandatory external audits, as some other corporate violators have received that as part of their settlements. And in this case, the settlement amount was very moderate in comparison to what it could have been. So the encouraging thing here in the lesson is that if a company discovers its violations and voluntarily reports them to the government in a transparent way, they really can still get very significant consideration and reduction of penalties.
Yeah, there's just, because 252 million to 1 million, that's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting take for a lot of companies right now. I think it's going to get even more interesting to see where we're going with, especially it's weird because I think the war will maybe have an influence into what will happen with this, especially because technology is just growing, right? I want to thank you so much, Valentin, for coming on and sharing these insights. And again, our listeners, I'm sure hopefully you enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed listening to this because it's very interesting. And again, you can catch this episode anywhere, also YouTube, and find us on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And I will be back next Monday. And Valentin will be with us April 7th for a free webinar. So thank you so much, Valentin. It was great to have you. And can't wait to have you back.
Thank you as well. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
Bye.